Muito bom dia a todos. Obrigado por não terem desistido e terem voltado este segundo dia. O nosso keynote é holandês e por isso eu vou passar para inglês para fazer a sua apresentação. Thank you, Karel, for being with us and having fixing some time to do this keynote. I will start to present you, and then you'll be able to give your presentation. So Karel Luyben is the Rector Magnificus Emeritus of the Delft University of Technology. He was Rector Magnificus of the Delft University of Technology from 2010 until 2018. Before that, he served as a Dean of the Faculty of Applied Sciences for almost 12 years. In 2083, he was appointed full professor in biochemical engineer at the Delft University of Technology, and from there has gained experience in research, starting at SME, research leadership, leading European organizations like the European Federation of Biotechnology and CESAER. Among others, he presently is a board member of CESAER, chairman of the investment board of Zuid-Holland, chairman of the board of the Dutch Tech Center for Life Sciences, national coordinator for open science in the Netherlands, chairman of the task force Open Science of CESAER, and member of the Open Science Policy of the European Union. And finally, he is also chair of the executive board of the European Open Science Cloud. Karel, thank you again, and you may proceed your presentation.
Thank you, João. I will then start sharing my screen, but this is not possible yet. I'll try again. Yeah. Now it's possible. Okay. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, let me thank the organization and in particular João for this opportunity to speak here on this Research Data Management Forum. And I hope that the information I'll supply you with about the European Open Science Cloud is useful for the discussion later on and for your thinking. I usually start my presentations with two definitions. One definition is on the open science. If we talk about science as it is, and we just for the sake of this discussion call it science 1.0, then we would like to move to a situation where science is more open, more shared, has another reward and recognition system, but especially where more data can be shared between scientists. And in between these two is, of course, a movement towards open access that has sort of started around 2003 and has progressed quite a lot already, but we're not there. We're still with, for example, PANES working hard to get further to open access. The most difficult, most demanding line is towards what I call fair data, or the implementation of the interoperability of data sets of researchers, with a lot of questions around it. What data and how do you do that? And the third one is what we call citizen science. And the three of those, we, at least in the Netherlands, have chosen as the three main lines for moving to the future. But there are a number of boundary conditions in order to get there. We need more skilled people, especially in the data domain. So skills is an issue in getting towards more open science. The rewards and recognition system, I already mentioned it. It is geared in many cases too much towards only number of publications and no number of citations. Not that it is wrong, but this is a one-dimensional approach. So we need a more multi-dimensional approach there. And then we need some metrics to monitor the progress with respect to how we are developing in the direction of open science. This transition is what we have defined in the Netherlands as the transition to open science, which we are trying to stimulate and support. Another definition is that of fair data in relation to open data. For me, open data are data that are available openly, free, at the point of access for everybody to use. not necessarily containing the metadata you might need, not necessarily having the opportunity for interoperability. This is what we call fair data. Fair data are data that are as well findable, accessible for those that have access, interoperable so you can combine them with other data sets, and reusable for those that can and want to reuse them in other cases, combining them with data sets. Of course, with publicly funded research, we would like to make as much of our data open, but they have to be fair in the first place, otherwise we cannot do the things we would like to do. So my adagio is towards as fair as possible and as open as possible. Fair is a set of principles. It's the moving target, you could say, because these principles are further developed with standards and help for getting to these principles. And over the years, these fair demands will increase in time. But for now, we can conclude that not all data can be open. That's impossible if there's confidentiality involved, secrecy or protection of humans, etc. If I use the word data in my whole presentation and also in the parts I said before, I mean any digital object coming from research. So data in the traditional sense, code, other research output that can be put in a digital form. So I'm not confining this to only the traditional definition of data. And these data sets and data need identifiers that have to be persistent. We sometimes call them GUPRIs, global, unique, persistent, resolvable identifiers, or PIDs in short. We need, of course, the standards I was talking about in the FAIR application and the code. And last but not least, a lot of work in many cases is to get the contextual documentation or the metadata with the data. Not necessarily the same data set, preferably even in a separate data set, which in many cases where the metadata can be open, the data themselves may not be open. For me, EOSC, the European Open Science Cloud, and forgive me with respect to the words, because we didn't choose them, and in the end it should not be European, it should be global. In the end it's not open data, but fair data. In the end it should not only be science, but all the domains, also the public domain and the private domain, and it's definitely not a cloud, it's a federated structure. But apart from the fact that all these four words are wrong, this is the word, this is the acronym we use and we keep on using. So EOSC, in my view, could be seen as a twin sister or twin brother, if you want to the e-infrastructure organizations or e-infrastructure systems. And I'm not talking about research infrastructures, I'm talking about e-infrastructure. So those that are offering store, compute, and connect services, where the data is in a yin-yang situation connected to that, and it should offer the data themselves and the interoperability. E-infrastructures without data in them is nothing, empty. And data without e-infrastructures to work with them and to service them and to transfer them and to store them is also nothing. So these two cannot live without each other, and therefore the yin-yang picture for the two. But it's good that we see both angles, because there's been a lot of attention and effort and money going into the e-infrastructures, and the attention and effort in the interoperability and the servicing of the data could increase, in my view, and is relatively cheap compared to what the e-infrastructures cost. In her presentation in Davos, Ursula von der Leyen was talking about EOSC as one of the things in the domain of digitalization and of data, especially as the second priority, by the way, after the Green Deal. And she called it a web of scientific insight, which is a nice term as far as I'm concerned. And we are talking in our proposals about a web of fair research data for the time being. FAIR is the acronym again, and by web I mean the following. Maybe it's good to explain that a little bit, because by simply using the word, it's not always obvious what we mean. If we look at the World Wide Web as it is, this can live and exist based on the internet. The internet for me are the hardware connections, and the web of pages, as we call it, the World Wide Web, is the information on there. And we've been able as human beings, much more than we had expected 30 years ago, with these web pages and the HTML and XML languages, to connect these because they have unique identifiers, and to build on that services for like booking a hotel, booking a plane. At least in the past you could book a plane, and doing financial transactions as an example. These are all services that grew on top of the web, as we call it, the World Wide Web. If we would have the majority of the relevant, with emphasis on relevant, data set of researchers available through the internet, we could create a web of fair data or fair data sets based on that. If they have unique identifiers, if they can be found, if they are fair enough. And again, we can and will, and there are already many examples of that, build services on top of that. Many more services than we now can imagine could be built if we could get much more data sets as well available, and especially interoperable. In my view, less than 1% of the data sets are on the internet available at the moment, coming from research. Analysis gives something like 80% is not available. That depends on how you do your counting. But if I say less than 1%, I mean all the data sets, and not all the data sets should be there. The first important thing is to realize what data are relevant to be put out there and to create metadata for, so that others can use the data and can combine the data with their own data sets or do their own thing with it. The aim thus is to create such a web in the form of a federation of the existing services and new services to come. So it will be sort of a virtual space where science producers and consumers come together, where they can find the data of each other, they can use the data of each other if they are available, depending on how accessible they are, of course, and interoperate with these data. In our view, this is a sort of an open-ended range of content, like the World Wide Web and the services on top of that. And if we would, let's say, be sort of the first or early on in Europe to start with this, we could even build something like the quality mark data made in Europe. Actually, the United States, we have been in touch with Australia, Canada, China, all say Europe is in this moment leading in this domain. What are the issues with respect to the transition to what we call the second phase of of EOSC? We have defined the first stage as the things that have happened in the past in EOSC projects by calls by the Commission, and the stage 2019-2020, when there has been and still is in place the Executive Board and the Governance Board as a governance structure for the EOSC. And it is this governance structure, the combination of the Executive and the Governance Board, to create sort of the governance for the second stage. Well, the issues in order to get there are certain boundary conditions. I will, in my next slide, explain those. We have to define the core activities that are needed after 2020. We have to take into account the data services infrastructures in the countries. These data services infrastructures are different in the different countries, of course, and we have to be able to accommodate that. Otherwise, it's not going to work. We cannot top-down decide for the countries what type of data infrastructures they should have. Of course, countries can learn from each other and some influence will be there, but it's not a top-down system. We have been and are at the moment finishing this, created a legal entity, an association. I will come back to that, that will operate from the beginning of 2021. And in the long run, this needs a business model to sustain itself. In the shorter term, it will be contributions from the members and from the European Union. And the implementation timeline or work plan is basically that we have to finish this before the end of this year. The boundary conditions for EOSC, as I mentioned, are that we see this process has been started by Europe by different proposals, by different calls and different projects. Rather heterogeneous, to be honest, but at least it's a start for what we could call the beginning of EOSC, and we will continue to need core funding for this from the European Union in the future. Another boundary condition is that it should be as inclusive as possible for all stakeholders. So we should try to accommodate as well research performing organizations, research funding organizations, service providers on the data, etc., and try to be as inclusive as possible. It should follow the subsidiarity principle, like Europe itself. It should not do things that can be done in the countries or that can be done by a single repository. It should work on the combination and the interoperability. And this can only work if the providers within that system will have a shared purpose and share a purpose of serving the research community and later on other communities with their data. As I already mentioned, countries have different structures, not only infrastructures, data infrastructures, but different structures, and we have to be able to deal with those. The system should be such that organizations can, looking at the rules of participation, decide as much as possible themselves whether they can be included, and then if they comply with these rules, should be included, so self-inclusivity as much as possible. Of course, the system should not be dependent on a certain type of hardware, so it should be hardware agnostic. And it should focus, this is a boundary condition given, but also an essential one, on fair data and the related services. Therefore, we call it the web of fair data and services. So what are these core functions we have been talking about? Something the association, which I will be talking about in a minute, will have to deal with. First, we have to develop and govern this federating core, and I will define the federating core in a few minutes. We'll have to manage the compliance framework and manage a trusted certification. If I use the word manage in these two lines and in the lines to come, I do not mean that this association has to do this managing all of them themselves. This can be outsourced to other organizations that are already familiar with, let's say, compliance framework or with AAIs. Managing the authorization and authentication infrastructure is something some organizations are very familiar with. So by saying the EOSC association has to manage that, doesn't mean that this managing has to be done in the association itself, can be done in an organization and be outsourced by the association. Manage the PID policies, as I mentioned. Of course, has to do the outreach to stakeholders to make clear what is the benefit of the whole system and to sort of promote the system. We have to monitor the services and transactions taking place in the system. And if we want EOSC to be a certain trademark or a mark of quality, we also have to see to it that the EOSC trademark is managed. And last but not least, we have to contribute to Horizon Europe policy. If not, then we are not going to expect money coming from the EU in the near future. So towards a EOSC association has been the term we have coined quite a bit this year, and we are well, gradually getting there. We are, as far as I'm concerned, almost there. So this will be, the association will be a Belgium AISBL. This is an international non-for-profit organization according to Belgian rules, like many organizations are, based in Brussels. The criteria for membership are currently being discussed in the EOSC governance, but you should think about research performing organization. Then the question is how large should they be, or should every individual research institute be a member? Still to be discussed. Research funding organizations, of which we have, of course, much less, and service providing organizations. By service providing is service providing on the data, of course, research data in the beginning. This association is working towards a partnership with the Commission, and we have put forward a partnership proposal, which you can find on the internet. It's been published by the Commission, and this partnership proposal will hopefully lead to a partnership agreement to be signed in the beginning of 2021, most likely January. So just after the governance and executive boards and their working groups will cease to exist, because our mandate is till the end of 2020. This partnership will be in the form of an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, and added to that MOU will be a strategic research and innovation agenda, and I will come back to that in a minute. Basically, if you want to join the system, joining the EOSC Association is thus joining the partnership we are making with the Commission. We look at the EOSC Association at its inception. It's a legal entity with a relatively small-sized association, that establishes a open and in an open and transparent manner a vision and a roadmap for the implementation of the European Open Science Cloud. And this SRIA, or Strategic Research and Innovation Agenda, we are writing now already on behalf of the association, which will be in place next year, but then it will be put in the hand of the association in order to maintain it and to update it in a yearly format. So the legal entity will then monitor and coordinate this implementation over the years to come during the Horizon Europe program. And the implementation of this SRIA will be in a two-tier approach. One tier is the implementation of grants following from calls for proposals from the Commission. So this is implemented by the Commission, you could say, under the condition of the Commission. So the money will not flow to the association, the money will flow directly to those that react to a call set out by the Commission, and the consortium that get a grant will get the grant directly and not through the association. And the other tier will be implemented by the members of the EOSC association under their own responsibility and rules. So we have to define what is this in-kind contribution, what fits with the EOSC framework we are trying to create, and can be counted as the, let's say, balanced contribution coming from the countries or from the members. At a later stage, when a sustainable business model has been created, when the association has grown, the legal entity may also take on or outsource some of the EOSC operational core functions directly themselves, assuming, of course, that the resources are there to do that. And the ambition of the EOSC legal entity is to expand its membership in such a way that it will progressively become a wide, inclusive, and representative partnership with all the EOSC entities committed to implement this EOSC vision, including, as of around 2023, 2024, private organizations and other public organizations that are not doing research and possibly education. What is the timeline? Well, this is too complicated to explain, but this is basically the timeline to set up the association. We are somewhere around here, and we are actually indeed finalizing the statutes. This will be a discussion later on today in the governance board. We have a governance board meeting this afternoon. It says here May, but this has been the one in June, which has been postponed till the 1st of July. And we hope to finalize or get agreement on the statutes this afternoon. Then the starting organizations, the founding organizations have to be defined. Two of them have been mentioned already by the executive board, being João and CESAER, and two of them will be mentioned by the governance board this afternoon. We have decided to make the group of founding members as small as possible, because the founding members have no additional rights compared to all the other members, and that makes the life easy to go to the notary in order to found this association. But the first act of the association will be to admit a whole bunch of other organizations that are on a list of either candidate founding members or as those organizations that want to become a member and have put their name on the list in the EOSC Secretariat. We are translating the statutes as the next step, and we will have a consultative meeting, not in June anymore. This will be July or the very beginning of August, and then the first General Assembly most likely in September. So we're pretty good in the time frame we have designed in January this year. As I said, the first iteration, we also call it sometimes the minimum viable EOSC, will be, of course, the core function to create interoperability, and around that there will be the data that initially will be part of that first operation, and what we call the EOSC exchanges, the services on top of these data offered to the outside world. So it includes the core, the exchange, and federated data sets. It must enable the federation of existing, but also open up, of course, for planned research data infrastructures. It should federate the disciplinary clusters as well as regional projects as a first critical step. And we would like to start the first couple of months with simple use cases. So not only fair data, because all the data have to be fair data, as fair as possible, as I said. It's a scale, but also open data in order not to work in the very beginning with sensitive or closed data. But of course, fair does not mean that all the data will be open. And of course, also data that are not open will be included very quickly. This will be done by the association, which you see here on the left, the EOSC association, which will have a general assembly of all the members. They elect an executive board, and they will have, well, we call it now a secretary general instead of an executive director. And it is to co-create the overarching SCRIA, which we are drafting the first version of. And we are designing a steering board existing of the member states and the associated countries, which formally is outside of the association. So formally it has an advisory role to the association, but this board, of course, can be influential in what is being done in and by the association. The association then has to create and run the core functions. So there's an office function, it creates the technical standards, it looks after the PID and a help desk, and these core services will be budgeted by the Commission. The SCRIA will lead to suggestions from the member states to the work program for Horizon Europe, and the work program will then lead to projects either contributing to the core or contributing to the other services that are possible in this minimum viable EOSC. Members or their countries or national funders can also offer services in the EOSC exchange. And in gray, you see the commercial service providers, which we definitely do not exclude, but it's not something we start with in the very beginning. Later on, this minimum viable EOSC, which was the orange part here, should be extended with exchange markets, you could call it, for the private sector and for the other public sector, for example, for education, but also research institutes in countries like statistic institutes or whatever you have, like the institutes that are gathering data for COVID, for example. So the extension to serve the public service, the sector and the industry will come later on, as I said, around 2024 as it's planned now. And these are not completely new users. In many cases, there is a relation already with the research organizations doing, for example, work together with the industry or doing with other public sector organizations research work. Ideally, this would be one marketplace, but it could be that different requirements for the private sector or for the public sector will lead to different governed spaces around the EOSC. It's hard to tell at this moment, but ideally this would be created into one single marketplace. And with that, I would like to thank you for listening and stop my presentation, stop sharing the screen, and give the floor back to João.
Okay, thank you, Karel. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. We now have 20 minutes for questions and answers. You can place your question on the Q&A button. And in the meanwhile, while you are thinking about the questions to ask, I will start by doing some questions. And the first one, it connects to the close of the yesterday forum, where I was asked, okay, EOSC is a fantastic concept, but what is that we have to do in practice to adopt it?
Yeah, thank you for the question, João. What you have to do in practice to adopt it is depending on what type of organization you are. Let's assume you are a university and you are performing research and creating research data and also using research data. You most likely as a university could become a member of the association and then contribute to what the association will create in Europe and later on outside of Europe, that fits with the requirements you have as an organization. Suppose you are a research funder. the same story applies. You could join as a member of the association and influence that this fits with what with what funders could fund and what requirements funders could put with research projects they fund. And last but not least, the research infrastructures, the e-infrastructures, and all the other providers of services on top of data or with data, or for storage or for connect or for compute facilities. These organizations are very welcome to join again the association in order to jointly define what is the best offer we can do jointly to the research community. For me, the most, let's say, pressing things in order to build this into a larger and better system is seeing to it that we get more data that are relevant available and that we get the interoperability going. Sometimes interoperability works within certain disciplines, like CERN has been doing that for a long time for their 3,000 researchers. But interoperability between disciplines is a very difficult thing to implement, and there are good concepts out there, and I think we have not put enough money and effort into that interoperability, which we have to create. So joining the EOSC association would be one form of, let's say, joining the party and adopting the system. And then from that, you can learn what is needed.
So just a follow-up, so what kind of members do you have in the association, just to inform the audience?
Yes, I expect the final decisions have not been taken on that, but will be very nearby. That individual universities, individual research institutes, individual provider organizations, for example, research infrastructures or e-infrastructure organizations, European ones as well as national ones, could and should become a member of the association. So the whole group of stakeholders relevant for this development.
Okay, we already have some questions. The first one, where is the implementation muscle for the EOSC MVE? Teams from previous projects, how do you achieve some stability and get out of the project wheel?
A very good question, Christina. We have been fighting to get out of this, what you call project wheel. It's a good term. It's a new one for me. For a long time, because what we have now is a bunch of projects which have done interesting and creative things in many cases, and of course have met their KPIs as good as possible, but not necessarily have worked jointly to a common goal. And this is the advantage of creating a strategic research and innovation agenda jointly in order to make this common goal and in order to have new projects that are financed by the Commission coherent and with certain requirements. Let me give you an example of what I call a little bit crazy. The projects that were going on so far had the right to maintain the outcome of the projects themselves. So the consortium was the owner of the outcome, which is normal in the European system. Now we're talking about open science and open data. Come on. If that cannot be shared with the others and if it doesn't serve a common goal, we are not getting there, in my view. So that is one of the initial boundary conditions I think the Commission should change for new projects coming on. But it's the joint willingness of the members that creates this SCRIA that will have to lead to a better coherence or a concentration of the projects rather than a diversity which we have seen now. Yes, this transition period will not be simple because we still have the Infra-EOSC 3 call, which, by the way, has taken into account the new governance in their proposal, I know, but still it's a call in the traditional sense from Horizon 2020. But that is the intention to do, and there we have to create a muscle. Together with the countries, by the way, because a lot of the implementation will and has been done in organizations in the countries. Again, difficult to make that coherent.
We have another question from Christina. So can legal issues with data become one of the main concerns?
It is a concern. Whether it's a main concern, I don't know. But we are working together with an outside party and a specialist on what we call a legal framework, a legal interoperability framework, sorry, in order to see that these issues with respect to the legal issues can be covered. But yes, it is an issue, and so we have to deal with it. But in general, for research, publicly funded research, my view is rather simple, the same as with publications, which, by the way, in the future may become, let's say, the metadata with the data. So the publication could be part of the metadata rather than the main thing. But apart from that, in my view, this is owned by the person or the research group that made it. And it's up to them to decide with whom they or he or she will share it.
Okay, thank you. I would like to recall the participants that you can ask your questions using the Q&A or raise your hands. I haven't checked for raised hands, but please do so. So I would like to now to ask a question strategical related. So this edition of the forum for research data is devoted to research infrastructures. Besides being EOSC governing board chair, you are also chair of Open Science in the Netherlands. What advice could you give to Portugal, to the several types of members in order to embrace EOSC? How are you organizing things in the Netherlands?
Yeah, it's a story in itself how we are organizing things in the Netherlands. What I could do is show you very quickly, if I can share my screen again, the ambition we have with respect to how we organize the data landscape. So let me share your screen again. It's in one of my backup slides. Let me remove some of the things down here. Here it is. So this is what I call the NL, the Dutch and Netherlands National Data Services Infrastructure. And it is composed of a layer that has the e-infrastructures. In our case, this is the e-science experts that do the storage, that do the compute, that do the connection. So this is the Netherlands e-science center. DANS is such an organization, but there are several organizations, about 5 or 6 of them, which we are trying to regroup a little bit, but they are offering the e-infrastructure. Then we need a layer of what we call countrywide network of experts, so-called data stewards, and I mean the word data stewards very broadly. I will come back to this layer. And then what we are trying to create is a coordination team in the Netherlands of about, let's say, 40 data stewards coming from the different domains. We think in terms of domains. The domain of the health sciences, the domain of the technical sciences, the domain of the exact sciences, and the domain of social sciences and humanities. And for these domains that have some specificity, of course, the disciplines have even more specificity. You could have a team of, let's say, 10 per domain, roughly as an average, that then come together on a national coordination team. These are then linked with what we call DCCs, data competence centers in the different research organizations. Most of our universities now already have these DCCs. They are also stimulated by NWO, our national funder, that has a special program on that. And we have proposed a larger program to stimulate the development of these data competence centers in universities or research performing organizations. Of course, in the end, these organizations have to pay that themselves, but in order to make the transition faster, it's good to get some extra money and then in 5 years' time, take it over as an organization. The actual number of data stewards here is the people at the bench and the people in the DCCs. These are, in a broad term, data managers, sometimes bachelor educated data stewards at the bench of the researchers. So you have all kinds of levels and therefore data stewards between parentheses. Basically, we are setting up this system in the Netherlands at the moment in order to sort of structure our data coming from the research performing organizations. And what we will try to do, we haven't finished yet, is next to the organization called SURF that will be responsible, and this is bottom-up paid by the universities, will be responsible for storage, connect, and compute. Have a separate organization, a smaller one, that does the coordination of the data, that is emphasizing on interoperability and the data angle, in order also to connect this to EOSC in a country sense. There will be several organizations, of course, become a member of EOSC. For example, the funder, the national funder, and SURF will most likely consider to become a member of EOSC, or of this association.
Okay, thank you very much for your useful and clear explanation. We are far behind, so it's.
I'm sorry, it's up to you to keep the time.
No, far behind the implementation and.
Oh, sorry, I thought we were far behind time.
No.
May I give one more tip then?
Sure.
This is broader because you referred to me as being the national coordinator for open science. I've been a member of the OSPP, which, by the way, has stopped officially in June or something like that. But the Open Science Policy Platform from the Commission has produced a final report in June. You can find it on the internet. And this gives an overview of what type of state of implementation the different organizations now have. And I think this is an interesting document for research organizations, either performers or funders or infrastructures, to read, and that gives them sort of a framework of where do we stand with implementing open science in our country. In the Netherlands, we have a steering committee on open science that is chaired by the ministry, and it has the national funder on board. It has all the universities on board, the polytechnics, the service providers, etc., etc. It's a small group as a steering committee and a larger group as an advisory board, which work together to plan. And we're actually writing our second plan for open science in the Netherlands for the period 2020-2030. The first one was 2016 to 2020. And now we're moving into a 10 years framework because we think it will definitely take that time and more to really implement what we want to do with respect to data. Last remark, and I can give you the reference, João, if you want to, is on the internet available also the document we made for the transition costs to stimulate this development and what it will cost the country to do so. It's in English and available for other people to read.
Can you highlight the main figures of the investment for?
Sorry, you say?
I like the main figures regarding the investment. Can you highlight them? Because we discussed.
Yeah.
Well, preparing this. Yeah.
We have made sort of three levels. The first level is as what we have been doing, but then a little bit less. So diminish our effort rather than increase it. We didn't want to do that, but we showed what that means, and that was an investment of about 5 million up to 5 million per year for the country. Then there is the range up to, let's say, 20 million per year, from 5 to 20 million for what we call in line with the rest of the world. And ahead of the pack, we said something like double that amount. And the answer of the steering committee was, we want to be ahead of the pack, but we want to pay only the amount from the middle, which we could have expected, of course. So this is what we're trying to reach with the investment plans we have put forward, is 20 million per year for the coming 6 years. We haven't got the money yet, but that is this is with the ministry at the moment as a proposal.
Thank you so much.
So if you want to scale that, how many people are in Portugal living?
It's half, I would say 10 million.
Yeah, so it's roughly half. So if you divide these numbers by 2, you're very close.
Okay, thank you. So sorry for jumping between the strategic and more practical questions.
That's okay.
The next question is from Rui Figueira from the Biodiversity Infrastructure, and is thanking your presentation and asks, interoperability might be the most challenging FAIR principle to put in practice, especially among disciplines. What role can have the EOSC Association to that it can be achieved, considering that many times these communities were quite isolated?
Yeah, the last thing is, of course, get the communities on board and talk to the communities. But this is one of the major difficulties. And what the association definitely will put in its SCRIA, that this is an extremely important development that needs to take place and needs to be financed by projects. We have, for example, in the Netherlands, but several of these are international projects, several projects going on to show how to create what we call, in this case, interoperability. And this is what we call the fair digital object frameworks. This is just a name, but what you do is you strictly define what a fair digital object is, and then you create a framework to link these objects together, irrespective of the discipline. And it needs a lot of knowledge about the ontologies, it needs a lot of knowledge and description of the metadata, so it's not an easy thing to do. This is also what we have been doing and are doing in what is called the Vodan network of GoFair, for the outbreak of Corona. There we have in Europe been collecting data, putting in to the EMBL database. It's been very clear that combining data into one database is one thing, but combining data to use data sets coming from different angles is the most difficult thing. For example, in this case, the clinical data coming from the hospitals cannot be combined with the biological data or genetic data. Yes, the biological data and genetic data, as EMBL has been doing already for a long time, has a certain basis in the genes and they can be combined to a certain extent. So this, on the one hand, shows clearly, I think, this COVID example, that it is useful to combine data sets and to make them open and to work towards interoperability. It also clearly shows that we are definitely not there. If you ask me personally, and I usually give the answer, if in 20 years from now, we would have 50% of the relevant data as fair as possible and interoperable, I would be very, very pleased. So I repeat, 20 years from now, 50% of the relevant data. And relevant data is only a small portion of all the data that are being produced by researchers, because you cannot, of course, keep all the data. It is extra work. We need data stewards for that, to do this extra work, but we have to get used to the fact that instead of having your 21st PhD student, you rather should have a data steward doing that type of work, so that not all the researchers have to do it themselves. So this is a broad answer, but hopefully it gives you some insight on where the association, in the form of the development of its SCRIA, wants the Commission to invest. And I think personally, the Commission has not been investing in this domain sufficiently. It's been investing too much in the traditional organizations that have been there and maintained for them to be there, rather than to create this interoperability.
Yes, I truly believe that that will change, but of course it will take time and
yes,
a lot of effort. But as the Commission will also ask for EOSC compliance in many of the next to come calls, I expect that can accelerate EOSC adoption. So I think we have a final question. This one going back to the strategical business things. It's being asked by the research infrastructure microbial resource. And the question is, can you elaborate a little more about the EOSC business plan for the next coming years? Where do you see more difficulties to get the minimum funding to operate? We have kind of addressed this, but
no, I can say a little bit more about it. Huh? So the association itself, ultimately, let's say in 1 or 2 years from now, has to be paid from the membership fee. And we expect, let's say, a couple of hundred members, and then we need something like 2 million euros per year to have this small organization as an association running. That is not the content, that is not creating the interoperability, that is not the EOSC itself. Yeah, the EOSC itself is this federated virtual infrastructure. Mm-hmm. This is the EOSC association as a group of members. If you then think a little bit further in time, and if you have commercial providers coming in, and if you assume the following calculation, this is a calculation I often use, that roughly 5% of the research costs have to be devoted to data in one form or another, infrastructure, data stewards, you name it. Some people think this is a lot. Well, I can tell you, we did a calculation. Our universities are now spending 3% of their research funding on data already, in storing them, in computing them, in having people helping them. So this has to expand, especially in the domain of humans data stewards. If we would spend 5% on data, and if 1/5 of those 5%, so 1%, would be spent outside to service providers that can help us with the data, and there will be many of those, and there are quite a few already, the traditional ones like the Elsevier's of this world, but also the ones that offers compute services or other services. If we would spend 1% outside, that would be an enormous business model. Make the calculation, how much money is Europe spending on research? If 1% would go to outside parties to stimulate them to keep on offering the services, that is a business model in itself. And if you do this calculation, it can easily cover the costs to create new things. And it's the same with the internet. So who maintains the World Wide Web? Well, the fact that there is money to be made by the services offered on the web maintains the web. And here you will see the same. Ultimately, there will be money. Money can be made by the services offered. And this money is then, in my calculation, roughly 1% of the research budget of all the organizations together. It's a very general answer, but I hope it gives you some feeling.
Yeah, we can see it the other way around, is how much do we spend by not sharing?
That's a very interesting question. The calculation of PwC, the accountant, is that we lose 10 billion euro per year if we do not do this. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Karel, we are on time. I truly thank you for being with us. It was, for me, a presentation and a Q&A fantastic. I would invite you to stay for the rest of the session, but it will be in Portuguese. And I hope to see you in 2 hours from now in the...
yeah, you will be in the governance board, of course. Yes, yeah. Of course. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, João, for inviting me. It was a real pleasure. It's a pity I couldn't see all the participants, but I just say goodbye to all the participants. Thank you very much.